Chapter 11. Time had passed. With great fanfare, the incredibly advanced ship Adrian left the planet of Galimar and set forth on her mission. The ship was now in orbit over a beautiful planet of blue oceans and verdant plains. But it wasn't Eden. The Eden mission had been both a colossal failure and a massive success. It was a failure since the mission to visit the planet dubbed Eden had to be scrapped, though it was through no fault of the mission planners. There was no way they could have known that the planet, or more specifically its sun, would choose now to blow itself up in a massive supernova. On the other hand, it was a resounding success because of the incredible capabilities of the redundant safety features built into the Adrian, not to mention the guidance coming from the synthetic life found in the captain's amulet. That intelligence, who goes by the name Galimar, was single-handedly responsible for taking the necessary steps that saved the vast majority of crew on the ship. Still, though, the Adrian now found itself in orbit around a beautiful world. Captain Adrian had just awakened from his stasis pod and with a great amount of effort emerged into quarters that were in complete disarray. There had been a shelving unit that fell against the door to his pod, and so it took a while for him to slowly dislodge the seal to his pod, work his arm around the door, and push the shelving unit away. Only then was he able to swing the door open and see the mess present in his living space. While the suspended animation process was perfectly safe, it still took a few minutes to shake free of the effects of having essentially been dead for whatever period of time one was in the chamber. Stumbling across the room, Adrian looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, and his breath was completely taken away. There below the ship was Eden, an incredible sphere of blue oceans and tan-colored landmasses. As his eyes scanned over the amazing jewel hanging upon nothing in the blackness of space, it occurred to him that the planet appeared to look a little differently than what he had expected. Actually, several things just seemed off. Why did the planet look different than what he had seen from long-range images? Why were his quarters in such disarray? Pondering this question made him immediately think about his family, and with a sudden start he snapped his attention to the other side of the room, and the suspended animation pods near his. Seeing that the status indicator lights on each pod showed green, he was more than a little relieved to know that all was well with his family. Still, though, what happened? His amulet companion Galimar, who had been functioning as acting captain while he was asleep, would know.
Galimar, status report.
No answer.
Galimar, status report.
Still no answer. Now, this was indeed troubling. Why wasn't he answering? He certainly had the ability to hear Adrian from anywhere on the ship. Why was he so silent? For a moment, Adrian thought about reviving his family while he was here, but he knew that they would be awakened as part of the general and systematic awakening that would happen for all crew members around the ship. One's not familiar with the suspended animation technology would typically ask why you wouldn't just revive everybody all at once. The main reason why you wouldn't do that was because it took a considerable amount of energy and other ship resources to revive a person from a pod. If you are talking about one pod, that would be no big deal. But since the ship had over 1,300 crew members on it, the revival process had to be systematic. Not only that, but Adrian knew that he had a greater responsibility to the members of the crew to find out what had happened and why his acting captain was no longer responsive. No, he needed answers, and he needed them now. To that end, Adrian emerged from the front door to his quarters and struck out for the bridge. As he walked down the hallways toward the main lift, he saw that much of the rest of the ship was in the same tangle as his quarters. It almost seemed like someone had come aboard the ship and purposely put things in disorder. A silly thought, really, but he just had no idea why the ship would appear as it did. Getting to the lift, he stepped in.
Bridge.
The doors closed, and the lift began to move. Being that he was the captain, his quarters were situated rather close to the bridge, and so it only took about 5 seconds to reach its destination. When the doors opened, he was greeted with yet another room that was thrown askew. Chairs that were normally situated in front of workstations were toppled over, and there were several ceiling panels that hung down from their normal places. It didn't appear as though there was any real damage to the structure of the ship, just a mess. As he walked over to the captain's chair, whose swiveling base was bolted to the floor, and so it remained where it should have been, he looked to the cradle near the chair, where his amulet and his amulet companion should have been. The stand and amulet cradle were there. The amulet and Glendara were not. With wide eyes, Eobach excitedly started looking for his friend, only to find the amulet lodged under the floor edge of the science officer's station. Picking up the amulet, it didn't seem any worse for wear, and so he returned to the captain's chair and placed the amulet in the cradle.
Glendara, are you there?
A few moments passed, but then a holographic image began to form in front of Eobach. Glendara looked back at Eobach.
Eobach? Is that you?
It is I, my friend. Glendara's eyes closed, and a look of immense relief came across his face.
Oh, thank goodness. I was convinced you were dead.
Dead? Why would you think I was dead?
How long have you been awake?
Asked Glendara.
Just a few minutes, really. I was awakened only to discover my quarters and actually the entire ship was in complete disarray. What happened?
Well, actually, interrupted Eobach.
Before you answer that, please check the status of the crew. Are they all right? Stand by.
Glendara appeared to dip his head as though he was thinking. In reality, he was connecting to each of the 132 secondary computers on the ship and obtaining status reports from each of them. Some of those computers oversaw entire floors of the ship. Others oversaw ship systems such as heating, ventilation, electrical, and plumbing. Still others supervised the shield technology, or the engines.
Status check complete. 98% of ship systems functioning normally. There are 34 suspended animation pods that are not reporting accurately, but other than that, all systems are nominal. Other than those 34 pods, all suspended animation chambers are green.
Why do you say they aren't reporting accurately? Asked Eobach.
They are reporting that there is no occupant in the pod. However, you are the only one that has been revived, and so their response must be flawed,
answered Glendara. With a relieved tone in his voice, Eobach responded,
Good. So, you were saying? I was about to tell you what had happened. The voyage seemed to go well after we left Galimar. I had been maintaining communications with Gasia all along, although as the ship went farther and farther, each transmission ended up taking longer and longer, as expected.
Eobach nodded.
After a few years of no interactive stimulation with the crew, I wrote a program that would continuously monitor 1,372 measurement points around the ship. I would go in a stasis of my own, and this program would revive me if anything needed my attention.
Okay, responded Eobach.
About 2 weeks before we had scheduled to prepare for orbit, we received a transmission from Gasia. They strenuously advised me to turn on my long-range scanners ahead of schedule, since they were witnessing troubling images coming from our destination solar system. After turning them on, it became apparent that the Eden sun was about to explode.
Explode?
Yes, Eobach, explode. By that time, the sun had already expanded beyond the orbit of Eden, and the planet we had intended to explore was no more.
Up to this point, Eobach had been standing, but upon hearing this news, he had to reach for the arm of the captain's chair and slump down in the seat. This was terrible news.
Wait, if Eden is no more, then what is that planet we are orbiting?
Asked Eobach.
I do not know the answer to that question.
Eobach looked down and pondered the spectacle of Glendara's tale. On one hand, the knowledge that the planet that he had worked so hard to meet was no more? Well, that was devastating news. On the other hand, the ship and the crew were all safe, and they were indeed orbiting around an amazingly beautiful world not their own. Discovery and exploration were at the core of each Galimarian, and from the look of things, it seemed they would certainly have that with this new planet. And since they could no doubt go back home whenever they wanted.
So, what did you do when you saw that the sun was about to explode?
Asked Eobach.
I saw that the engines were already being stressed in order to maintain the course of the ship,
responded Glendara.
And knowing there wasn't any time to revive you before action was needed to be taken, I decided to put the ship into a slingshot trajectory around the sun. My hope was to achieve escape velocity and safely flee the danger. I programmed the course into the navigation system, set the engines to 108% capacity, and engaged the thrusters. The good news is the tactic worked, and we achieved the necessary velocity and escaped the gravitational influence of the wildly expanded sun.
And the bad news? Prompted Eobach.
The bad news? Well, I swung the ship around, pointing the main deflector shields toward the sun in case something happened. I fired up all 6 shields so that we would be safe. As soon as I did all that, the sun exploded with the resulting shock wave traveling straight for us. As soon as it hit, my connection to the ship was severed, and that was the last thing I knew. I had to assume that the ship had been destroyed, and that I would be floating around in space for the rest of my days. Seeing you now is an answer to a hope that I had given up on many years ago.
How many years ago? Asked Eobach.
All these events happened almost exactly 600 years ago,
answered Glendara. With a great exhale, Eobach felt like he had been hit in the gut with a punch. What was he going to tell the crew? What would they think? Would they all blame him for not preparing for this? Eobach sat there for a while, and Glendara could see the face of his friend passing through several emotional states. The reading he had done earlier in the voyage about Galimarian psychology helped Glendara to see that Eobach needed some quiet time to process the news he had just been given. If he was blood and flesh, Glendara would reach out to his friend and put his hand on his shoulder. If Eobach had come into the virtual reality world of the amulet, Glendara would have done exactly that. But this holographic interface of the ship didn't allow for that.
Am I the only one that has been revived so far?
Asked Eobach.
Yes. Please revive the chief engineer and chief stellar cartographer, and as soon as they've come around, ask them to meet me on the bridge. As you wish,
responded Glendara.
Oh, and Glendara? Yes, Eobach? Thank you for saving our lives. I would have expected nothing less from such a capable acting captain.
Glendara smiled and said,
You are welcome, my friend. It is good to see you again.
Glendara's image faded, and once again Eobach was left alone on the bridge. He sat there contemplating the marvel of the moment. Gazing out the observation windows, he considered what the next steps would need to be. It only took about 10 minutes for Rizak Deshan, the Erigina's chief engineer and officer of sciences, and Chikorov Lenin, chief stellar cartographer, to report to the bridge. Upon arriving, the two men commented to Eobach about the state of their respective quarters and how they wondered what had happened. Upon being told of the events surrounding the destruction of the original destination and how they had been adrift for the last 600 years, they reacted much the same way Eobach did. After giving them a few minutes to get over the shock, Eobach had to break through to them and get some answers.
Gentlemen, I wish I could give you more time to grapple with this news, but I need you to step up and get me the information I need before I inform the crew of our status. Rizak?
Straightening his back, he responded, "Yes, sir."
I need you to scan through the ship to make sure all is well. I have been informed by Glendara that there are 34 pods that are not responding properly to his queries for information. Please determine from him which pods those are and report back their status. I also need you to begin the process of crew revival. Chikorov?
Yes, sir.
I need you to get to work and find out exactly where we are. We know the planet we are currently orbiting isn't Eden, but I need to know what it is, and, more specifically, where it is. I also need you to plot a navigation solution for our return journey home. While 600 years is certainly an inconvenience, it isn't the end of the world. And, Rizak, once Chikorov has determined where we are, and thus where Galimar is, send a message to them letting them know we are all right. No doubt they think we were vaporized by the supernova.
Yes, sir.
Dismissed.
The two men went to their respective stations and began their work. It was now time to put into operation the mission plan that was originally intended for Eden. While this is a different planet, it was still very intriguing. Liquid water, green-covered land masses, snow-covered poles, and even what looked like arid deserts. Yes, this planet needed to be explored.
Glendara.
Once again, a holographic representation of Glendara appeared in front of Eobach.
Yes, Eobach? Please execute mission plan phase Alpha Tango 1. You wish to revive the landing party? Yes. We need to see what we have to work with,
responded Eobach.
As you wish.
The flight preparation and briefing room was small, and was filled with faces that were all intensely focused on Rizak Deshan. Behind him were Eobach and Krelon, listening as Rizak filled in the landing party on what led them to the planet they now orbited. As Eobach watched each of the men in the room, and more specifically as he watched the effect the news had on each one of them, Eobach observed that their reaction was similar to the effect the news had on himself. Each man looked lost, as if all energy in their limbs had vanished. It occurred to Eobach that this was going to be the same reaction of the entire crew, and so, when the time came, the news needed to be given to the crew all at once. Gentlemen, I know this has been hard news to deal with, but I need you to keep it to yourselves for now. The captain will be holding a meeting with all crew in a few hours, but I need you to get the lay of the land first. We want to be able to tell the crew what this planet is like, and we need to know if it is a place where we can explore before we go home. Understood?
Yes, sir,
came the response from all the men in the room. Captain of the landing party, please state your mission objectives and who you have chosen to be in your landing party.
Yes, sir.
My name is Docius Atlantis, and I am the pilot on this mission. We will be taking one of the shuttles equipped with a palominium pod from the Erigena to the planet. We have a total of 4 crews that will land in 4 different locations that we will choose at random once we get there. I will then land in a 5th location by myself and take samples of some of the flora. To my right, we have Team 1, Simeon and Gael, and next to them is Team 2, Drake and Juleron. To my left is Team 3, Kodin and Colin. And finally, next to them is Team 4, Kyrus and Cameron. They have all been trained in various fields of study, including anthropology, zoology, archaeology, and in case we meet any indigenous life, linguistics. After a few hours, I will then retrieve each landing party and return to the Erigena for debriefing. We are ready to do so at your word. Gratified that this was a well-trained and well-equipped landing party, Rezax replied, "The word is given, Captain. Return soon, and return safely." "Yes, sir." Turning to his crew, Docius responded, "Let's move out." The crew immediately stood and left the briefing room, leaving Rezax, Eobach, and Krelon standing there alone. The 3 men looked at each other. No words needed to be said, yet volumes of communications passed between them. Meanwhile, the crew boarded the shuttle, and Docius expertly piloted the landing craft from the hangar. The craft was not only a marvel in technology, but it was just plain beautiful in appearance. It was amphibious, and to that end was built with a large number of windows all around, allowing the occupants an unimpeded view of the world around them. As the craft descended into the atmosphere, wind gusts could be felt against the craft, and as they got closer to the ground, they could see features now that couldn't be seen before with the naked eye from space. It was immediately obvious that there was indigenous and intelligent life on this planet. The first landmass where they came relatively close to the ground was a peninsula that was roughly shaped like a woman's boot. As they passed over a city, it was Kodin that observed that not only were their life forms bipedal, but more importantly, they had seen the ship as it flew by. Knowing that contact with a race that was from another world might be difficult to adjust to, coupled with the fact that this landing party wasn't authorized to make contact with another race if it could be avoided, Docius accelerated away to the horizon. Still, though, their ship made an indelible impression on many of that time, including some artists who ended up showing the ship in their later paintings. One by one, areas were selected that were relatively close to civilizations, but only close enough to observe from a distance without interaction. While there, they would observe each portion of society and how they interacted with each other, while simultaneously gathering examples of local vegetation and minerals. Kyrus and Cameron selected an area that was in the upper middle area of a major continent. The area seemed to be both waterless and barren in some of it, but also had some grassy and luxuriant portions as well. The people that they were observing from a distance seemed to look very similar to Galimarians, but they definitely weren't as advanced. They had very distinctive features, including eyes that tapered down on each side. From there, the craft was flown in a southerly direction until it landed on a very large island. Most of this island continent was desert and dry, but the edges were very green and fertile. Drake and Juleron chose this area to explore. Simeon and Gael waited until they crossed a rather large ocean to choose where they wanted to land. It took about 5 minutes to cross over that ocean, and when they did, they chose a landing site that was completely filled with vegetation. Immense forests were present, along with very long rivers meandering through the trees. There seemed to be several small and primitive villages here. The overwhelming amount of plant and animal life here was hard to pass up. Finally, Kodin and Colin chose an area that was on a continent directly to the north. This continent was grassy and fertile for much of the eastern portion, and the western half featured very tall mountains and beautiful forests. In some of the areas, those forests sloped down to the nearest ocean, and so it was rather exquisite to see. Once all the landing teams had been deposited, Docius remembered seeing a very interesting civilization while they were flying over that boot-shaped peninsula earlier. Knowing that the other teams were in areas that had a great deal of vegetation, he didn't see an overwhelming need to gather that himself, as he had originally intended. He decided that he would just find that area he had seen before and land there to observe what those life forms were like. Returning to that peninsula, he then crossed over a small body of water to its east and settled near a lagoon that itself was near a city built on that main part of the continent. Since his goal was stealth, he made sure the ship was buttoned up tight after he got off. He then reached into a small pocket on his belt, retrieved a small remote control, and pressed a couple of buttons. Doing so, the craft raised itself and hovered for a few moments until it passed over to the middle of the lagoon. It then lowered itself and submerged below the water, safely hiding until Docius returned. The land in this area of the planet was mostly dry. However, it was obvious that it wasn't without precipitation on a regular basis. The trees and shrubs appeared to be deciduous, and it appeared that they had begun to lose their leaves. Docius noted this in his journal, and also noted that this meant the presence of seasons on this planet. For a moment, he wondered if this planet had the same type of seasons as Galimar. Sitting there, Docius observed that there was indeed an overwhelming amount of life on this planet. Not only was there an incredibly varied amount of flora, but there was an unbelievable amount of animal life. Sitting there, he counted at least 7 different types of birds that were all going about their business, looking for the necessities of life. One of them even had plumage that... Suddenly, Docius heard a word spoken behind him in a language he didn't recognize. Spinning around, Docius came face to face with what appeared to be a young woman carrying a large jar on her shoulder. She was actually rather attractive, and when Docius smiled, she responded in the same way. The woman spoke again, still in a language he didn't recognize. Docius, of course, had no idea what this woman was saying, but it was obvious that she was neither a threatening party, nor was she threatened by Docius. It turned out that her garb was similar to the draped clothing that he was wearing as well, and so perhaps it looked like he was just resting for the time being. Still, now that he had been seen, there was going to be no way he could effectively communicate with her unless something was done. Knowing this might have been a possibility, each landing party was equipped with a modified version of the Galimarian amulet. This amulet didn't have a companion, but it did have the ability to connect to the mind of the wearer, sharing the Galimarian language. And so it was an indispensable part of communicating with new cultures. As long as a member of an alien race wore the amulet, he or she would be able to understand Galimarian. Reaching slowly into his pack, Docius retrieved the amulet and held it out to the woman. With hand signals, he indicated that he wanted her to have it. Again, she spoke, and it seemed as if she was asking a question. With more hand signals, Docius held it out to her. She seemed to think for a while, but then she put down her jar of what appeared to be water and took a tentative step toward him. Slowly, she held out her hand, and Docius gently placed the amulet and chain in her hand. She smiled at him and took a step back, but she held it in her hands. it became apparent that she wasn't going to put it on. And so, with more hand signals, he pantomimed the action of putting on the necklace with its amulet. She smiled again, and though she didn't know why this complete stranger wanted her to wear a piece of jewelry, still, it was beautiful and golden. She hadn't seen anything like it before in her life, and so she decided that it couldn't hurt to see what it looked like when she was wearing it. Docius watched as she put on the amulet and was gratified to see her eyes close and a peaceful look appear on her face. This was the proof he was looking for, to show it was having the needed effect on her. It only took a few moments for the effect to complete, and for her to open her eyes again. Docius decided to test whether the language connection was successful.
Can you understand me?
Yes, I can. But I can't tell you why I can, responded the rather bewildered woman.
It's because that amulet gave you the ability to understand me.
It gave me your language? How is that possible?
The answer to that would be difficult to explain, but the first thing you need to know is that I am no threat to you. I am only here to observe you and your planet.
My planet? Said the woman. It was more of a statement than a question. Docius silently berated himself for using that word on this woman who probably had no knowledge of life beyond what she knew from her own village.
I mean your country, corrected Docius. I see that you have some beautiful animals I have never seen before, and so I was just taking some notes.
I see. Are you staying anywhere locally?
Staying?
The woman seemed to think for a moment. Then she said, Where do you sleep?
Oh, I understand now. I am just a traveler visiting your area. I am not staying anywhere, responded Docius.
Then you must come to our house. I was just about to prepare the evening meal for my husband and myself. You must eat with us.
Oh, I wouldn't want to intrude on your home, replied Docius.
Nonsense. It is our custom to show hospitality to travelers, returned the woman.
Well, I suppose I must accept your gracious invitation then. My name is Docius Atlantis.
Pleased to meet you, Docius. My name is Cathena. I don't know why I know I can trust you, but I just do.
That is an effect of the amulet that I asked you to wear. It is how I help people know that I am no threat to them, and as long as you wear it, it helps you understand me.
Once again, how is this possible?
May I wait to tell you the answer to that question? When I am eating with you and your husband, I will tell you more. Is that okay?
Asked Docius. Smiling, the woman replied, You are being very mysterious, Docius, but for now I will acquiesce. If you follow me, I will take you to my home where my husband awaits.
Lead the way,
smiled Docius. Cathena and Docius proceeded to walk along the pathway toward the village where she and her husband Photios lived. Along the way, Docius saw an overwhelming amount of vegetation and animals, both wild and domesticated. The architecture of the village was of homes that were built into the side of a mountain, and the homes were all white in color. They all appeared comfortable, and the people who saw Docius all stopped and stared. Docius asked Cathena why the people were staring. It's because you are so tall. I have to admit I've never seen someone as tall as you are.
Oh, I guess that makes sense,
accepted Docius. From then on, each time he came upon a new person in the village on the way to Cathena's house, Docius would smile, and they would smile back. The more he interacted with Cathena, and the more he observed the people living their life and gently interacting with each other of their family and friends, Docius began to really enjoy this people. He thought to himself that they were peaceful to the extent of almost being an enlightened race, like the Galimarians. It was very disarming to Docius to be amongst a people that weren't very different from himself. The only difference was the technology that Docius possessed. The same technology that Docius felt he personally didn't really need, or even want, in his life. It was there, but he knew that personal interactions with family and friends were far more important than material possessions. That, in fact, was a big reason why he married his wife Sauri. She felt the exact same way. Ultimately, the two reached a dwelling. She turned to Docius and asked him to remain near the front door, which would allow her to let her husband know he was there. Slowly, Docius closed his eyes and dipped his head, showing his acceptance of her request. She entered the home and closed the door. Docius looked around and saw a boy herding a few animals in an enclosed field across the passageway. The animals seemed mostly white in color, and their fur appeared very fluffy in texture. The boy had a long stick in his hands, and he would use the stick to gently prod the animals in the direction he wished for them to go. Docius made a note in his journal about how this society was mostly agrarian, and to that end was remarkably peaceful. The door behind him opened, and Cathena emerged with her husband behind her. He approached Docius and held out his hand in a gesture of greeting. Docius was unfamiliar with this type of greeting, but he decided to reciprocate in kind. Once again, her husband spoke in a language that Docius did not recognize. "He is saying, 'Welcome to our home,' and that his name is Photios," translated Cathena.
"Tell him that I am honored to be welcomed like this, and that I bring peace to his home."
Cathena looked at her husband and translated that phrase. Photios responded and again spoke in a language that Docius did not recognize. He then gestured toward the door. Cathena said, "He says that the honor is ours, and he says to please come in." Docius smiled and entered the home. The evening was short, lasting only 2 hours, since he had to get back with his team. But in those 2 hours, his conversations with Photios ended up being life-changing for Docius. While Cathena prepared the meal, Photios put on the amulet, and so he was now able to communicate with Photios directly. Docius learned that this culture was one called Greece, and specifically the village where he had landed was called Neapoli Voion. In this area there was a lot of agriculture, and in fact that is how Photios made his living. Photios herded sheep, and he hoped that he would be able to raise a family that would all do the same. Raising sheep wasn't the only thing that could be done, of course. There were many crops that could be raised locally too, including this tree that yielded a berry called an olive. After a lot of work, it became edible and was rather delicious to Docius. Docius learned that Greece was known for much more than its agriculture, though. He learned that Greece was well known for its interest in the arts and sciences. In some of the larger cities, there were centers dedicated to learning and philosophy. He learned that hospitality was a way of life for them. When Docius explained that he had to leave, they were obviously dismayed, but not as dismayed as Docius was. They reluctantly allowed him to leave only when he promised that if he could, he would return. Walking back to the beach of the lagoon, Docius felt as if he had left a part of himself with Photios and Cathena. These people lived exactly the way he and his wife had always wished to live. He felt like he was a puzzle piece, and this civilization was the puzzle he had been searching for. Flying away in the shuttle, he decided he needed to tell his wife about this place. He couldn't wait to get back to his new friends. It turned out, though, that the rest of the landing parties had a much less than positive experience. By far, Simeon and Gael had the worst experience of all. While secretly watching the proceedings of a citywide gathering, they witnessed the stomach-turning ceremony of a people that called themselves Aztecs. The zenith of this ceremony involved the ritualistic sacrifice of one of their number. When they saw the grisly scene unfold, they decided to get away from there as quickly as possible. Drake and Juleron observed a very dark-skinned people that were very primitive. They were mostly hunter-gatherers and didn't seem to be able to come close to being at the same intelligence level as Galimar. Coden and Colin had observed a set of people that were much the same as Drake and Juleron. They were peaceful, but not even close to a level of civilization that merited first contact. Finally, Kyrus and Cameron told the tale of a people that was led by a man called Genghis Khan. While this man seemed to be able to rouse the people in a great way, he did it by threat, violence, and even genocide. Definitely not a people that Galimarians would have anything to do with. Docius related his experience to the group, but they all seemed to feed off each other in their stories of terrible experiences. Upon returning to the Erigena, the reports were all related to their superiors, but it seemed that his positive experience paled in comparison with how bad the other experiences were. This didn't change how Docius felt, though. He knew he needed to go back. He knew his wife, Saori, needed to know how these people were exactly what they had been looking for.
Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.